Hey everybody, thanks for joining us today. You are here for the Youth Talk starting 2019. It's Disability History and Youth. So thanks for joining us. We have Rosie and Scott that are going to lead us through some great information today. We are going to get started in about 5 minutes, top of the hour. So just hang out a bit longer and then we're going to go ahead and get started. If you need anything before then, the chat is located at the bottom right part of your screen. You can type in there. There's also a raised hand option at the top of your screen, and you can click there, and that lets me know you have a question or a comment. And then there's also *# for anybody that prefers to use the phone, so you can jump into that as well. Everybody is muted right now, but it's always great to just remember to mute from home. And just want to make sure that if you need CART, that is provided at the bottom of your screen to the left. So look forward to getting started in about 4 minutes. Hey everybody, we're going to get started in about 1 or 2 minutes. So just hang out for just a little bit longer. You are hopefully here for the Disability and Youth Talk. If not, stay a while. It's going to be a good conversation. Talk to y'all soon. All right, everybody, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks for those that have joined us. My name is Sierra Royster. I am the Youth Programs Coordinator at APRIL, which is the Associations of Programs for Rural Independent Living. We are starting on, I think it's our third year of Youth Talk, so thank you for joining us. We're kicking off the year this year with Rosie and Scott, and we're going to be talking about disability history in youth. We're going to spin that idea of a boring disability history presentation on its head today. So I hope that you are willing to step outside of your comfort zone and join into the conversation, because we're not only just going to be talking today about disability history, but what history is going to be looking like going forward. So I'm really excited that you're able to join us. We are going to be using the Adobe platform today, so hopefully you're able to access that if you would like. You can find that cart is provided below on the left part of your screen. If you have any complications with that, please message me below in the chat box, or you can email me. My email is April, A-P-R-I-L Sierra, S-I-E-R-R-A, R-O-Y-S-T-E-R, at att.net. I'll put it in the chat box as well. So as we're getting ready to get started, looks like our cart box wanted to take over our screen right now. We'll work on that in a second, but now everybody can see it. Today, while you are listening and joining into the conversation, please know that the minutes or the transcript will be sent afterwards along with the audio recording. So you can definitely join into that as well and follow up and review everything. And then the PowerPoint should have been sent to you beforehand with the login information, but that will also be resent out to you as well. And today, we do have the phones muted today. So if you do have a question or want to make a comment throughout, you can do so by dropping a question in the chat box when we get the cart lowered back down. And then you can also press the person at the top of your screen with their hand raised. That lets me know you have a question. And then you can also press *# on your phone, and that will enter you into the queue and let me know that you would like to talk also. So I ask you to join us in the conversation, and any of these different platforms would be great. So we also ask that you ask the question throughout if you need to. We don't want you to hold on to a question until the end and then you forget it. So if you need to ask throughout, you're more than welcome to do that. But without further delay, we are going to go ahead and get started. So Rosie McDonald, and I should have asked you how to say the last name. I'm going to mess it up. Is a young, fierce, and determined advocate who has been fighting for youth with disabilities since the beginning of her time. Raised in California, the birthplace of disability rights, Rosie was mentored by many great leaders in the movement who demanded she do things her way. Rosie attended her first youth leadership forum for students with disabilities as student delegate, which quickly kick-started her passion for advocacy into a career. She swiftly interned in Washington, D.C. with the Japanese American Citizens League and supported the ratification of the Convention on Rights for People with Disabilities. She helped pass Disability History Week back home in California, worked in the classroom one-on-one with students who are blind/low vision, all while continuing an integral role in YOS. Rosie's love for Colorado landed her in another historical battleground, where she leads the Youth Transition Program at Atlantis Community Incorporated. So she is fantastic, the summary of her bio. And then another fantastic person, one of my favorite people, Scott Burlingame, and he is the Executive Director of Independence Incorporated, a resource center for independent living in Minot, North Dakota. He has worked in disability rights movement for 18 years and has worked serving people with disabilities in various roles for more than 24 years. Scott has been appointed by the governor to serve on the State Independent Living Council and the State Rehabilitation Council. Scott has been a member of the HDI Board of Directors since 2013 and was elected Vice President in 2008. Scott serves on various local and statewide councils and boards, including the North Dakota Associations of Nonprofits. Scott is married with 2 kids and enjoys ice fishing in the winter. Scott also writes for his blog at nonprofitthoughts.com, which is a fantastic blog. And if you follow him, you got a little insight to maybe some of the conversation for today. So if you'll just give me 1 second, we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to have this cart drop down a little bit, and then we'll get started. For the moment, while we're not using the PowerPoint, Rosie and Scott, do you want to start moving?
Sure.
Sounds great. Thank you so much, Sierra, for the introduction. Good morning and afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're at right now. My name is Rosie, and today we're going to be doing disability history then and now. We have an agenda for our presentation today. As Sierra mentioned, feel free to ask questions as they come up. Don't feel like you have to wait until the end if you have comments or any thoughts that you would like to add to the presentation. Scott and I welcome that. We'll also have a section at the end for questions as well. So while Sierra gets the PowerPoint up, I'll give a brief overview of our agenda. So we had a great bio read by Sierra, but Scott and I will give you a little bit more of our history and what we have at stake in presenting disability history and why we love it so much. And then we'll go into different aspects of disability history, including education and employment. We have healthcare. We'll talk about laws and policies, culture, and housing in the independent living movement. And then at the end, we will talk about ways that we can have youth and youth advocates contribute to the future and what our history will look like 30, 40, 50, 100 years from now. Scott, did you want to add anything to our introduction before we get started?
Yeah, actually, I'm going to real quick because I realize that the cart rider can't stop if we don't stop. So
Okay.
just give me 1 second and we'll listen to the silent awkwardness. Sorry, guys. Just bear with us for 1 more second. It was going too well. That's what happened here. And as that's uploading, I will send everybody a link out if you need that cart in case we had to stop sharing. But that way you can still have access to it if need be. All the background fun that I was having before you jumped on of converting. Oh, I've been talking for a good little bit, and you guys haven't heard a thing. Unmute yourself from home when you need to talk as well. So that is the text stream. If you are able to need CART, for some reason it wanted to take over our screen today. So if you want to access CART, you can follow that link in the chat box there, and you can still follow along. And then Rosie and Scott, if you would like to take over, that would be great.
Perfect. Thank you. So earlier I went over the agenda. This is the agenda from our PowerPoint. I might have gotten the order mixed up in terms of the different categories within disability history, but again, we will go over education and employment and then jump into healthcare, housing and independent living, culture and language, laws and policies, and then talk about what the future will look like. Can we go to the next slide, Sarah?
So one of the things that we want to do here, and kind of, as Sierra said when she was introducing us, is that oftentimes disability history can sort of come across as a little boring. And we talk a little bit about how most of the people that are deemed as youth, or in fact almost all the people deemed as youth, weren't even born when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed. And so much of those folks who have been doing this a little bit longer, so much of the rich history of disability is really the olden days to so many of our younger folks. So what we wanted to do in our presentation today is to really tie in not only what were the youth stories that were involved in the olden days disability advocacy, but also what has happened post-ADA. And then once in a while, too, we'll talk a little bit about what are the things that are going to happen in the future. What will be the things in 20 years that they're going to be looking back at when they get to be a little bit older and being like, we were part of that history. We were there when that issue happened, or when that bill was passed, or when that law changed, or when that movement happened. And so that's a big part of kind of what we want to do throughout our presentation today, is to have that ability to tie everything together. And so as we do that, we're hoping to kind of use that as a learning tool for everybody on this presentation, as well as for the youth that we work with.
Absolutely. And on the screen, we have a quote by Cesar Chavez, and it reads, "Once social change begins, it cannot be reversed. You cannot uneducate the person who has learned to read. You cannot humiliate the person who feels pride. You cannot oppress the people who are not afraid anymore." And as someone who recently learned about disability history and the community, and also as someone who was born after the ADA was passed, I didn't live in a world where I didn't have rights or protections as someone with a disability. But I didn't know what that history looked like. I didn't know that there was a community that I belonged to that I could be proud of. And I know a lot of the questions come up when we're doing disability history of how do we get youth to care about something that happened a long time ago or that feels so distant from them. And hopefully by putting this presentation together with the perspective and the angle that we do have, we hope that it becomes a little bit more relevant and the youth can connect to it more easily so that they can feel pride and they can start to feel like they have agency in changing the world around them.
And so we'll start off with, obviously, what is the Americans with Disabilities Act? And in 1990, the Americans with Disabilities Act, with the help of many disability advocates from across the country. And, you know, the shortest way of describing the ADA, of course, is that it prohibits discrimination based on a disability. And if you look at the picture here, it's a black and white photo of a group of disabled advocates in wheelchairs walking and wearing shirts. They have the DAP logo on, holding up signs that say, "We shall overcome." And these type of photos you'll see a lot when you begin to talk about how the ADA was passed. And I think that, you know, when you look at this photo, one of the things that you can see is there are people of a variety of ages in it. You know, kind of an older, balding man and a young child there. A service animal is pictured in this picture. A, you know, kind of hippie-looking like dude is pictured in this picture. A couple of folks, or, you know, a handful of folks who are using wheelchairs. And I think that when we talk about that, it's important to remember that it was a group of a variety of ages. And as Rosie talked about, she may not remember what it was like when the Americans with Disabilities Act was passed, and she may not remember that, you know, what that story was. But when you think about it, the hopes and the dreams of the folks who signed the Americans with Disabilities Act have yet to be achieved fully. That every time you see a curb cut that doesn't exist, or every time that you're not able to access a public building, or every time that somebody that has a service animal is given grief by a business owner, or every time that that any you know, you get discriminated in the process of employment, or any time that you can't obtain any kind of a telecommunication device in a format that works for you. Those are all remnants of what life was like before the ADA. And if you flip that around and realize we've all saw those situations, but we also see situations every day where you can get into businesses, where you can request a reasonable accommodation, where you can use some sort of a telecommunication device to communicate. You can get into public buildings. Those are all proof of what has happened because of the ADA. So I have a friend of mine and one of my mentors who's a generation before me, and he talks about, he was actually, when you see the picture of the Americans with Disabilities Act being signed in the Rose Garden at the White House, he was actually in the audience that day. And he tells a story about what it was like. So picture traveling from Fargo, North Dakota to Washington, D.C. in 1990 before the ADA. There weren't, every single curb you came up to was a problem. Every single place that you came to was possible. It was just an ongoing way of barrier after barrier after barrier. So it's because of the ADA that we have so much of what we do now. And so that's kind of how we tie that story together, is that there are problems now, but they were way worse, and they existed in part because of the actions of so many amazing advocates over the years. Sierra, if you want to go to the next one. So one of the first things we're going to talk about today is education and employment, because when dealing with youth, those are oftentimes two of the most important things. Obviously, education is important because, you know, kids, oftentimes the reason they're learning about this Center for Independent Living, or they've had us invited into their world, is because of the importance of free and appropriate public educations for youth with disabilities, and what that story is and how that all comes about. And employment, I'm a big fan of I believe it was George H.W. Bush. He said employment is a great equalizer, and that so much that happens that is good happens because of employment. So we're going to talk about kind of the history of education and the history of employment.
Perfect, thank you. So the beginning of education, and the picture that we have on the right of the screen is a black and white photo of a classroom, but it almost looks like it's in a house, and it has a few students in beds and old folding wooden chairs with a teacher pointing at, I think it's a picture of an apple, I'm not quite sure. But this is what a typical school looked like, a school setting would look like for students with disabilities in the early to late 19th century. There were special schools that were built and created in the early 1900s, but a lot of them served as a residential facility and an institution. So it wasn't the school that we envision or think of today. A lot of it was very separate from other non-disabled peers and residential, as I mentioned. So it's very institutionalized and not integrated. Between 1850 and 1950, there were special classes with people who were trained to care for individuals with disabilities. And this is getting a little bit more familiar to what we know of as special education today, but still very separate. So these schools were typically for students who were blind or students who were deaf or hard of hearing, and they would just associate with the teacher or in a very medicalized institutional setting, whereas in the post-ADA, we have policies and laws that continue to grow and change for more inclusion of students with disabilities. So if we can go to the next slide, we will jump to post-ADA, and there's a photo of a young person sitting in a wheelchair receiving their diploma wearing a cap and gown. And this is to depict how far education has come since the early 1800s and late 1800s. In 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act was passed, protecting the rights and meeting the needs of young people with disabilities. It was later amended in 1997 as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this was the start of creating a support system of services and integrating students with disabilities into education. They've evolved and continue to change in terms of what the community is identifying as a need and ways that we can create further inclusion and mainstreaming students, which means not having separate classrooms, not having separate schools or institutions anymore, but having students with disabilities receive the same access to curriculum and instruction as their non-disabled peers. If we can go to the next slide.
So now we move on to employment. And employment is always going to be, I was talking about my bio, my first jobs in the disability movement were helping people get jobs. And so when you talk about employment, there's actually a long, colorful, and diverse history for employment for people with disabilities that does range and change and look a little bit different, obviously, based on disability. But it also makes a difference based on where you were born. It makes a difference based on your what culture you were a part of. It makes a difference based on what kind of socioeconomic environment you were born into. All of those things are sort of important when you look at the history of employment for people with disabilities. So in the photo, you see a person who is, this is actually a blind person in this picture, and I believe it's a she is making brooms. And this photo is roughly from about the 1930s, so it's black and white. So in pre-ADA, there's kind of the first laws that began to look at vocational education for persons with disabilities was in 1920, Public Law 236 essentially ensured vocational education to persons with physical disabilities who were unable to work. And so they were able to, begin that process. And later on in 1935, the Federal Social Security Act, which was part of Roosevelt's New Deal, made the federal and state VR programs permanent and provided benefits for persons who incurred disabilities that prevented them from significant employees. And then in 1936, the Randolph-Shepard Wagner-O'Day Acts and Wagner-O'Day Acts enhanced job opportunities on federal property for persons with visual impairments and established national industries for the blind. So those were some of those like early kind of revving up. Now, one of the things that you'll notice as you look at this is there's kind of a few different kind of eras that tend to happen when we talk about employment. The reason Public Law 236 happened in 1920 was it was specifically designed for veterans returning from World War I in order to become employed. So, and you'll also see that it was physical disability. So it was a lot of people with amputees that were kind of, or you know, people that maybe. So that was kind of how it spun off. And you'll also see then, of course, the other was a big social movement with the New Deal and Franklin Delano Roosevelt and those kind of happenings that kind of came about. And so as you follow that employment, it was kind of as either, unfortunately, if there was a war with a large number of people with disabilities because of the war, or a big social movement, that things begin to change and evolve, and employment for people with disabilities kind of grew out of those different movements and those different changes. So as you talk about, and again, going back to when we're teaching this to youth, especially younger boys are oftentimes interested in like the effects of wars. And we can say what we want to say about what that says about our culture, I guess, but they tend to get interested. So when you say, like, look, our heroes went off to war and they came back and they wanted to do something. They served our country well. It was time for our country to serve them well. And those type of stories kind of tying it all together and kind of working it into this you know, building up towards the post-ADA era. So Sarah, if you can go to the next slide, please. So then post-ADA. So the Americans with Disabilities stated that a covered entity shall not discriminate against a qualified individual with a disability. This applies to the job application procedures, hiring and advancement, discharge of employees, job training, and other terms and conditions and privileges of employment. And so if you see in this picture here, it's actually a picture of at the White House of National African American History Month and the Civil Rights Act from 2014. And so what the ADA began to do is it began to kind of to open doors for people with disabilities. Now, a little interesting thing that I like to throw out, because we do talk about how this can be a social movement and how perceptions come into play, is that the Americans with Disabilities Act was signed, employment rates for people with disabilities actually dipped. And it was sort of an unwanted, I guess, effect of it, because there was backlash, and people who didn't see the value or didn't have a perception of the value of people with disabilities in the workforce became worried. They were always worried about they were going to be sued, or they were always worried about that they had to hire people with disabilities. And there was actually a dip, and it took about 10 years post-ADA for people to start being able to understand and be able to see that people with disabilities, this isn't an affirmative action policy. It doesn't make you hire people with disabilities. What it says is that people with disabilities need to be given a fair shot, and they need that fair shake and that fair opportunity in order to participate. And so that's really what kind of came about as a result of that post-ADA movement. And it opened up so many more opportunities for people with disabilities. And over time, you begin to see a lot more opportunities for people with disabilities to participate in the work.
And Scott, just before you jump into employment first, the picture on the slide is of Claudia Gordon, who is one of the first African-American deaf women to be hired to work within the White House under Obama's administration. And she did a lot of work in terms of helping hire more deaf folks within the federal government and pursuing equal opportunities for people with disabilities in changing policies. So I thought it was really important to have her picture in this piece, and I didn't want to miss it.
Thank you so much, Rosie. I kind of like, I know her. Who is that? And I couldn't think of it, so thank you for bringing that around. Absolutely.
No worries.
So the Employment First movement, now, a lot of these, when we talk about the history, pre-ADA, post-ADA, so many of those movements were really about people and kind of special carve-outs, special ways for people with disabilities to become employed. But sometimes well-intentioned people ended up putting people with disabilities in some not quite so great work environments. And I mentioned earlier, employment was my first ever advocacy work, or first ever my personal employment in the disability community. In the company I originally worked for, I was a job coach, but we had sheltered employment. We had sub-minimum wage employment that we offered. And at that time, way back in the olden days when I first started, it was considered to be pretty cutting edge. It was considered to be the way that people with disabilities could get jobs. And again, this kind of movements go way back to Great Depression era, when they carved out the first minimum wage and they said, but what about these poor people with disabilities? Don't we want to keep them employed? And they said, well, we'll set up these exceptions to the federal minimum wage laws. And so Employment First is kind of the new movement. And I've been kicking on this Employment First stuff for about a decade now. And it's amazing how many changes have came about in that decade. So first off, let me just say that the Employment First movement is pushing for employment to be the first and preferred outcome for all people with disabilities. It defines employment as community-based and paid at a competitive wage. And as a result of this, it'll decrease unemployment among people with disabilities and put an end to sub-minimum wage and better employment-based integration. And, when I talk about this, and this kind of is all very post-ADA here, I remember when I first started talking about ADA, VR, vocational rehabilitation counselors, just told me I was crazy. Providers told me that we didn't know what we were talking about. We didn't understand the importance of any of this. And people were like, oh, this is like, how can you do this? Do you not understand that this is the only place for these folks to work? And so much of it kind of mirrored what I'd been also learning about with nursing homes, was that that's where those people should be. And in Employment First, one of the important lessons I learned is that we don't know how every single person in the country that's on a sub-minimum wage exemption is going to get a job working in the community at a competitive rate. But let's just start working on it with one. And then let's work on it with the next one. And then let's continue to move forward and find as many jobs as we can. Because sub-minimum wage jobs by nature set people up who show up for work every day, who, participate in the practice of employment, and it sets them up for a life of poverty. And we can do better than that. And when we stop accepting some minimum wage and sheltered employment as a good opportunity or as a viable opportunity, that we can move on. Now, that being said, we've never said we're not yet shut down every sub-minimum wage place. As I sit in the place, I'm actually in a hotel room today, and I can look through the window at a large sheltered workshop. And so they are still in existence and they're still around. But the goal is that how do I go to that sheltered workshop across the street from where I'm sitting and pluck off one person and go find them a competitive job? And then how do I go find it for the next one? And even more importantly, is how do I, with our youth, when our young folks are graduating, so when you're sitting in a group full of people, young people, we can talk about how, people show up for work every day, and I experience this. They work for an entire month and their paycheck is $5. And youth can understand that, and they can grasp that that's not a very fair thing. But then how do we work with those youth to make sure they never end up in that environment? And how do we give them the skills and everything else? So that's kind of what the Employment First movement is. So Sierra, if you want to go to the next one.
So tied to employment oftentimes is healthcare and healthcare benefits, and trying to make sure that if you do get a job that's competitive, that you also get healthcare coverage, because a lot of people with disabilities require that in order to get out of bed, in order to live the life that they want out in the community. And so the next section of our presentation is to go over what healthcare has looked like and what it looks like currently.
So pre-ADA, back in 1965, and so in the picture here is a picture of Lyndon Baines Johnson signing the Social Security Act. And in 1965, administered the Social Security Act established the Medicare and Medicaid. These services assist health care coverage for the elderly as well as certain individuals with disabilities with low income. So this is really the first opportunity for a large swath of our nation to be able to actually obtain health insurance. And this allowed people to get out of a lot of those. Previously, it was a lot more kind of poorhouse, if you will, or poor farm-based health places. So like you'd become a ward of the state, you'd be shuffled off to some sort of an institution, and that's where you could get health care, and that was it. And with Medicare and Medicaid, it began to provide that opportunity more in a community-based setting. So it really was part of that deinstitutionalization movement at a very beginning stage, and it provided for the first time Medicare and Medicaid. Now, those of us who work with or lived with or are currently on Medicare and Medicaid, there's some holes in the system and there's some problems with it, but it at least provided that framework to begin the health insurance for people with disabilities. And next slide, please. So post-ADA was, probably the most significant legislation that's been passed in the post-ADA era was the Affordable Care Act. Technically, the long title is the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. The slang title is Obamacare. And the Affordable Care Act is full of controversy, and it's obviously still full of controversy today, many years, 9 years after it was originally passed. But the reality is it did offer Medicaid expansion. So all the states that have opted into Medicaid expansion, my state of North Dakota being one of them, allows people to go work to not necessarily have to be on Social Security, but be able to get Medicaid. And that's been beneficial for me and my job, because people will come to us, and in order to get health insurance, in order to get Medicaid, they don't have to sign up for Social Security. They could continue to work and be part of that and do it. One of the biggest things, too, was it provided protections against pre-existing conditions. For people that don't understand that, it's amazing to me at how real that was for people. So just a little bit of an example is my wife is a person with a disability, and pre-Affordable Care Act, we had a gap in insurance, and because we were changing jobs and we were in our 20s, we didn't pay any attention to that. And she went to get insurance, signed up, had an illness shortly after she got it. The insurance company said, well, we'll cover any new conditions, but this was pre-existing, so everything that comes up based on, in her case, it's fibromyalgia, we will choose not to cover. So you picture how massive that is, and how that can be a very expensive thing. And so getting those obviously, disabilities in nature are pre-existing conditions, so being able to protect that. And there's a picture here that just says the Affordable Care Act and the official symbol of the government, or the U.S. president, I believe is what it is, I think. And so that was one of the kind of post-ADA things is being able to handle that and protect that. So next slide, please.
I actually wanted to stop right here and just remind everybody that, if you have a question or a comment, we've covered education and healthcare and employment thus far, and that's a lot of information to take in. If you have any questions, you can drop in the chat box, which is at the bottom of your screen, or click the person at the top of your screen with their hand raised, or press *# to enter into the conversation or ask a question. So if anybody wants to do that, you are more than welcome to.
And before we jump from healthcare really quickly and the Affordable Care Act, I also wanted to mention that another really important piece of the Affordable Care Act for youth specifically is that you can stay on your parents' insurance up to the age of 26. And that was a huge game changer in terms of thinking about how to transition from pediatric healthcare to adult healthcare. And we talked a lot about transitioning from high school to college or getting job readiness, but there isn't a lot of conversation within the community about how to successfully transition your healthcare and how to take over and make appointments for yourself as a young person when your parents or guardians have been doing it your whole life. And how to self-advocate when doctors and healthcare professionals aren't listening to you and believe that you know your body better than anybody else. So healthcare has a huge portion on our everyday life, on what we can do in the community, on our health and well-being. So I didn't want to gloss over that piece because I think it's really important, especially when we're working with young folks.
And Rosie, if I can jump back in too, great points, absolutely. And one of the other things that's important with the Affordable Care Act is it ended the lifetime limit. And so if you're a young person, especially a person that has a lot of health care needs or you got a lot of you need a lot of services, like that was something that was real. It used to be, for example, and it's going to sound like a big number, and I say this, I'll say like, you would have $1 million lifetime number. But I knew somebody, I do know somebody that, was a person that was employed, was extraordinarily smart, but had some pretty significant health care needs. And he was pushing up right about the time the Affordable Care Act was passed of hitting his lifetime limit. And his only choice would have been to quit his job and go get on Medicare and Medicaid because there was no option that his insurance was actually going to kick him off. So that's one of the things, too, is you look at, $1 million in today's healthcare world doesn't go as far as it used to. So that's one of those other things that the Affordable Care Act. So it's just that whole spectrum of being a healthy part of our community and being, participating comes along with healthcare. So thank you for jumping in.
Those are really great points. I didn't know that about the healthcare lifetime limit. So thank you for sharing that. And that 26 age is a game changer for sure. I don't see any questions right now, so just remember that's open throughout, and you can join in, and we'll keep going.
All right, next up is housing and independent living. I know most of us are, I'm assuming, most of us are pretty familiar with the independent living movement, and so I want to keep that in mind, but also not gloss over and make any assumptions. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll dive right in.
Really quick, I think we're going to we have a question on how the Affordable Care Act is different from Medicaid or Medicare.
So I'll take my best stab at this. So Medicare and Medicaid continue to exist and are kind of sometimes participate as part of the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act is like a 1,300-page long law with tons and tons of complexities in it. So there are some parts of it that, for example, I talked about expanded Medicare. That's actually part of the Affordable Care Act. The Affordable Care Act also has things like, healthcare exchanges, which is actually where you can potentially go and purchase health care on the private market. So that would be somewhat separate from Medicare or Medicaid. However, sometimes you could actually be on Medicare or Medicaid and get things on the exchange. So the Affordable Care Act, and this is one of those things that when you watch pundits on TV and they talk about, we want to repeal Obamacare. Well, the bottom line is it's really, really, really complex, and it's not a health insurance program. It's not like people necessarily go and sign up for the Affordable Care Act. Now, they might go sign up for the exchange and get health insurance through the exchange, which is part of the Affordable Care Act, but it's not necessarily a health insurance policy. So just to kind of attach that from another reason, so I just had a friend of mine do this. He went to the healthcare exchange, and he purchased through Blue Cross Blue Shield a health insurance policy. So his policy is actually through a private company, but he purchased his route to get there was through the Affordable Care Act, or through the healthcare exchange, which is part of the Affordable Care Act. So I hope that makes sense, Steve. So Medicare and Medicaid are health insurance policies. There are multiple health insurance policies and laws that are covered by the Affordable Care Act. And then, as we talked about earlier, there's a whole bunch of laws and mandates on insurance, both public and private insurance companies, as a result of the Affordable Care Act.
Yeah, and just to add one more thing, so when you were talking about expanded Medicaid, just because I know you, Stevie, we are one of those states in North Carolina that chose not to expand Medicaid. So we are dealing with different things, and that sometimes we hear Medicaid expansion a lot in that conversation, but it's kind of foreign to states that chose not to because we don't know what that could look like. So that's one thing that might have thrown you as well. All right. Great question, Stevie. Thank you.
And then if we can go to the next slide, we will start with Ed Roberts. So we have a black and white picture of Ed Roberts in his power chair and Herb Wilsmore, who's also in a manual chair, and it looks like they're at some type of stadium game, maybe. I'm assuming it's at Berkeley. But Ed Roberts was the first person with a severe disability to be accepted and graduate from UC Berkeley. He contracted polio as a teenager, and as a result used both a wheelchair and an iron lung. But Ed Roberts is most famously known as the father of the independent living movement, which started in Berkeley. And the piece that I really wanted to extract from this Ed Roberts story that I learned later after learning the basics of Ed Roberts is that he was a young person. He was a college student who got together with a bunch of other people who used wheelchairs on campus and said, hey, this campus isn't accessible to us, but we still want to go to college and get our degree. So they created a group on campus called the Rolling Quads, and it was a student-led movement that later became the Center for Independent Living in Berkeley, which was the first independent living center in 1973. And after that took off, Ed Roberts and a group of other young people, such as Judy Heumann, started this sit-in at the HEW building to encourage the signing of Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which protected people with disabilities before the Americans with Disabilities Act came into play almost 16 years later. So a lot of times we see pictures of Ed Roberts and he's a little bit older, and we talk about his involvement in the development of the independent living movement. But we tend to forget that he was a young student when he started this movement in the 70s. And it really uplifting that piece, I think, is really important when we're talking with youth, to say you could start something on your college campus too. It doesn't have to be a 26-day sit-in. It doesn't have to look like crawling up the Capitol steps. It could be starting a group called the Rolling Quads on your student campus and creating something that you don't already see because it's important to you. And one piece that I forgot to mention at the beginning of this presentation that I really have been honoring in the past couple weeks is this idea of advocacy being tied to science fiction. And so as people with disabilities, we live in a world that wasn't created with us in mind. It was created by non-disabled folks who are creating a world for them. So we are living in someone else's imagination. And as people with disabilities, as young people with disabilities, oftentimes we have to create a world that we don't see because right now it's not working for us. And so that means smashing the edges of the sidewalks so that we can create curb cuts. That means creating student groups on campus because we don't see representation of ourselves on campus, and so we create something. That means hosting Twitter chats. That means creating a blog for people to share. So it's reimagining the world, and oftentimes it's young people who are doing that work. And I don't want to forget that because I am assuming as a young person myself, and when I was learning about disability history, it just seemed so distant from me. And I didn't see myself in these leaders. As a young woman of color, I felt a little bit separate from all these change makers. But I'm realizing now that in the work that I do, in the conversations I have, similar to the conversations I'm assuming that Ed Roberts and Wade Blank had, that we just have to shake things up a little bit because we're not seeing the world that we want yet, so we have to create it ourselves. So Sierra, if you can go to the next slide.
Actually, Rosie, can I jump in here too?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I wanted to kind of build off of exactly what you were just saying, and remembering the fact that it's interesting because as you look at the history of the independent living movement, it's like in the last 10, 15 years, there's been this movement to talk about, like, we need to build programming around youth, and we need to make sure we engage our youth, and usually it's a bunch of old people sitting around talking about it. However, independent living was originally a youth movement. When we talk about getting youth engaged, that is getting back to our roots. That is doing exactly what we started off as. That's not the new thing. And you know, when I talk about this and I talk about Ed Roberts, I do exactly what you said, is that you talk about how, you know, this was a group of college kids getting together, and they were doing college kids things. Some of the things that they did were kind of things that were a little bit controversial and you know, maybe a little bit edgy. And even the fact, as you look at pictures like this, you know, the way they're dressed, to us in today's view, oops, I just dropped my phone, may look a little bit scary or whatever, but are like, I'm not scary, old. It looks like old people. But at that time, they were cutting edge, and I've even used those pictures and said, like, so what would somebody that was going to be radical in today's world look like? And you hear about tattoos or piercings or stuff like that, and you're like, if Ed Roberts lived today, he would probably have those tattoos and those piercings and stuff like that, because our youth, our movement was a radical movement to start with. And so just kind of building that bond between then and now. So that's all I have. I just wanted to throw that in.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So adding on to our youth movement, I wanted to highlight Wade Blank. So as Sierra mentioned in my bio, I'm originally from California and learned a lot about the movement of disability radical activists in Berkeley, but I didn't really know much about the disability rights movement elsewhere outside of California until I moved to Denver about 2 years ago, and I learned about Wade Blank and ADAPT and the Gang of 19. So Wade Blank was not a person with a disability, but he learned about nonviolent action in Selma in the South during Martin Luther King Jr.'s civil rights movement, and learned those strategies and then brought them to Denver, Colorado, where Wade Blank was the youth coordinator at a nursing home here called the Heritage House. And he would take these folks out to movies, and they would have posters on the walls within the nursing homes of, you know, famous musicians at the time, and he would take them to rock shows, and he would pile them all up in his VW bus and go out and live their best lives. But then he started befriending all of these young people that he was working with, and they said, we don't want to live in this institution. We were put in here by our family or our doctors, but we don't want to live in an institution or a nursing home anymore. We want to live out in the community. And so Wade Blank was one of the first people to start moving young people out of nursing homes into an apartment community not too far from our original office. And I like to say that he broke them out in the middle of the night and snuck them out of the back door. I'm not sure that's exactly what happened, but in my mind, that's what happened. And so Wade Blank was breaking young people out of nursing homes, creating apartments, and making them accessible, and had the care workers who were working for the nursing home come after their work hours to help these young people live independently in the community. And that was the beginning of the second independent living center in the country, following the lead of Ed Roberts. And this group not only became a family and a community, but they also became what we know of today as ADAPT, and they were starting to target public transit because now that they were living independently in the community, everything was great except they couldn't take the bus to go to the grocery store, or they couldn't get to the movies or go to these shows anymore. And so they started protesting RTD, which is the local public transit here in Denver, and they laid their bodies, all 19 young people laid their bodies in front of the busiest intersection in Denver for 2 days, demanding that public transit become accessible. And that was the beginning of the movement towards other ADAPT chapters growing and happening all across the country. So I didn't know any of this radical history until recently, and I'm very lucky to have moved from one birthplace to another and uplifting these stories. And working at ADAPT, I've gotten the opportunity to meet some of these young people who laid their bodies in front of the buses. And we just celebrated Tubby's birthday, and he just turned 79. But hearing his stories and seeing his pictures as a young 20-something on our walls of our independent living center is really powerful. And I don't want to lose sight of how powerful young people have been and continue to be. So we can go to the next slide.
Really quick, Stevie had a question when you mentioned collaboration, and I'm not sure if it was this slide before this or this one, but was that with college or university?
So it was at UC Berkeley, so it was a university.
Okay. And then just a reference below, Mary has posted a video that is a great short film about Ed Roberts and Wade Blank and Justin Dart Jr. And Stevie even mentioned that she saw a great movie about his story as well. So check that out. And actually, I think we have a question.
And as another resource, I can send out Rocky Mountain Public Television just did a documentary on the Gang of 19 and Wade Blank and his life. And it's called, I think it's just called The Gang of 19. But I can send out that link as well. And it's a little bit longer, and I'm just focusing on ADAPT and Wade Blank. So I can be sure to send that out to everyone after this meeting.
Awesome. And what we can do, because it looks like we're getting some more ideas of movies and different links online that you can check out. So The Power of 504, and then the movie Stevie was referencing was When You Remember Me. So definitely lots of good resources. And I think we have a line open.
Yeah, hi, thank you. This is Mary. I actually, they already covered what I was going to say, just talking about the young people movement. And I also just wanted to let you know, if you wanted to learn more about the 504 sit-ins that she referenced, I just dropped a link to the Power of 504. It is open caption and audio described, and it really talks about that whole history. Thank you.
Great. All right. We're going to keep moving ahead.
Great, thank you. So the next piece that I wanted to talk about is a picture of Lewis Curtis and the Olmsted decision. So prior to the Olmsted decision, which was passed in 1999, people with disabilities, specifically intellectual and mental disabilities, were put into nursing homes and institutions as a way for medical professionals to kind of out of sight, out of mind with the disability community, rather than integrating them into the community to live independently. And so the Olmsted decision justified the right for people with disabilities to live independently and have that choice and have the support to be able to live independently in the community with the support of, either an environment that would be safe and have folks come in, whether it was through Medicare or Medicaid and having the money to have those supports come in, or having job training and being more integrated in the community rather than having a structured living situation as you would in a nursing home or institution where you often don't have choice, you don't have agency over what you wear, what you're eating, who you spend time with, whether you can go out in the community and what that looks like, and then really exploring your own interests and taking that charge. So the Olmsted decision created an opportunity and a pathway for young people to not have to be forced into institutions. And although there are still institutions that still exist today, they're not as many as we have had in the past, and we're still working very diligently to move folks out of nursing homes into a more independent living situation. But the Olmsted decision was one of those monumental post-Americans with Disabilities Act legislation that helped people receive the services that they actually needed. And if we can go to the next slide. And the next piece that we're going to talk about is culture and language. So I'll give it over to Scott.
Yeah, really quick before we go to Scott, just a reminder that you can press *#, and I'll put that again in the chat box if you'd like to join in the conversation or you have questions about any of that. And then just remember you can drop in the chat box as well.
Sure. And when we're talking about culture and language, culture issues oftentimes can be controversial. And so a little bit of a warning to everybody that we're going to talk about a few things in the next little bit here that are a little bit disturbing and that can be a little bit uncomfortable. And, if it's too much, if you want to step away, that's perfectly fine. But I just wanted to kind of give that out there. We're going to talk about some things that aren't very comfortable. So, and also we're going to talk about some social issues that are pretty controversial. And it's not our goal today at this PowerPoint. It's not our goal as APRO as an organization or in this webinar to take stands on those issues necessarily. But what we want to do is to talk about the perception and the mindset that comes into play when these different things happen and why they happen, and kind of, again, going back from the history of disability, going back a few years, and then what society and how we view disability in today's world. So with that, Sierra, you want to flip to the next slide, please? So first off, looking at the value of lives for people with disabilities. So in the pre-Americans with Disabilities Act era, beginning in the early 1900s, there was the eugenics movement. And that movement sterilized those with cognitive impairments in order to cleanse the human gene pool of undesirable traits. This was done in many states, and it was actually sanctioned by the U.S. Supreme Court in the ruling of Buck v. Bell. Now, the interesting thing is that Buck v. Bell has never been overturned. It actually still can be used today by lawyers in order to justify these type of behaviors. So it still holds on. It is still part of what we are. So we had entire movements of people that were sterilized against their will. And this doesn't, again, it began in the early 1900s, but it doesn't go that far back. And in fact, there's still remnants of that happening in today's law. And then also in the 1940s, in 1941 in Germany, the medically administered program of, quote, mercy death was approved by Adolf Hitler, and about 70,000 Australian and German people with disabilities were killed, most via large-scale operations, including poison gas. So if you go to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., there's a part of it that just talks about this very issue and talks about how people with disabilities came in their wheelchairs, they came in their, they were with prosthetics and things like that, and they were murdered or they were terminated because they wanted to give a mercy death. Now, they weren't exactly asked, do you want a mercy death? Or they weren't actually asked, is your life horrible? It was just assumed. And so in the picture here, you see a sign from I'm not exactly sure what the era is, but it says some people are born to be a burden to the rest. And so it's really that view that people with disabilities, those of us with physical or mental limitations, are just a burden, and that really it would be best if we just kind of went away. And so that was kind of that pre-ADA movement. Next slide, please.
And Scott,
and so the first, yeah.
Just wanted to add something really quickly about the eugenics movement and forced sterilization. There's still overwhelmingly a lot of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities who are or have experienced forced sterilization without their consent. Also, during the civil rights movement, when there were a lot of women of color who were starting to take charge in the civil rights era, they would undergo or go to the hospital for a different illness, but they would undergo what they called a Mississippi appendectomy, and they would be sterilized without their consent as well. So it wasn't just people with disabilities, but also women of color. And unfortunately, this is still something that we're fighting today. And so I don't want to talk about it as if it has just been something that we used to do, because there are still people who are experiencing the effects of it today.
Thank you, Rosie, for adding that in. And I will add in, too, that when you kind of bleed together the different human rights movements that exist, that one of the realities, too, is that women in general, or for a long time, if they tried to assert their rights, were seen as being as having mental health issues. And there's a lot of, if you go back to, even as, early as, well, the example I'm thinking of right now is in the women's right to vote movement, where women who were asserting that they should have the right to vote were actually hospitalized and treated as if they had a mental health issue because they dared to assert themselves. And even it bleeds into our language, the term hysterical is a term that came from women who were asserting themselves or were being, too aggressive at that time. And so there are these definite movements that have happened throughout time to repress people who are trying to assert themselves in our culture. So, yeah, it's an exciting topic, isn't it? So, next slide. Oh, go ahead if you have more.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, I know that when Scott and Rosie and I were kind of talking about this presentation, one of the things that I had brought up was, we talk about this as pre-ADA, and, Rosie mentioned that this is still an issue for a lot of our community. Just a few years ago, I saw an episode of The Doctors on TV where they openly talked about, the pediatrician on the show has this younger brother that has Down syndrome, and they openly talked about how they sterilized him because he was not responsible enough to have a child, so they made that decision before him. Dr. Phil has polled the audience to see if people with disabilities should have children, and over 90% of the audience said no. So this is still that perception piece that we should not, according to society, and that not only is it perception, but it's still being carried out in different ways. So it's definitely, unfortunately, has followed the ADA as well.
So now let's look a little bit more into that about the post-ADA values. So obviously this idea that we're just going to round up a whole bunch of people with disabilities and take them to the, to the gas chamber sounds horrible, except for, many states and countries now are adding assisted suicide to the list of medical treatment options available to seriously ill people and people with disabilities. Now, if you look at this photo that's up right now, it's a photo that has some protesters, and they have a young woman is holding a sign that says "World's Cheapest Healthcare." Another person says, "I believe it's not dead yet," or "Not better off dead, not me," is what it says, or "Give me liberty, but don't give me death." And one of the things that you look at is that when you look at people that are choosing assisted suicide, the reasons they are choosing it actually very much mirror what we talk about in the independent living movement. They talk about, I don't have enough autonomy. I don't have the adequate health care. I'm not a participant in society. I feel like I'm going to be a burden to people. So when people are choosing those things, it becomes quite obvious that when we talk about the general life satisfaction of people with disabilities, that if they were happier, not necessarily because of their disability, but because of situations that they're occurring or their participation in their life in general, that they can do better. Also in today's world, we have Hollywood that makes movies, award-winning movies. Me Before You won People's Choice Award in 2017 for Best Movie. Million Dollar Baby won multiple awards back in the early 2000s. Both of those movies are about assisted suicide for people with disabilities. Both of them were written, directed, acted in exclusively by people without disabilities. And both of them kind of told this picture and sold this image in the mainstream culture that people with disabilities are a burden and that they, you know, these champion people that were going to choose assisted suicide, that, you know, they were doing it in order to ease the burden of themselves on everybody else. And another thing is that prenatal diagnoses such as amniocentesis and ultrasounds have made it possible for parents to abort children with detectable disabilities. This has led to a great reduction in the number of children being born with certain types of disabilities. Disabilities such as spinal bifida, disabilities such as Down syndrome, things like that. So parents are actually able to make that decision. And again, I'm not interested in having the debate on whether or not parents should or should not have that decision. What I want to have the debate around is, how are we viewing people with disabilities, and how do we look at that, and how do we view that as a culture that, you know, people with disabilities would be better off dead. And that's really kind of the scary thing that still exists in our culture today. And remember, the eugenics movement and the sterilization movement, those things were done as part of what was extraordinarily popular. They were done because it was oftentimes people without disabilities perceiving how horrible life was for people with disabilities. And those lingering things continue to exist today. So, yeah, so I think that's all I have on that.
Just remember, if you want to join this, we understand this is a hard conversation to have, and it may make you feel uncomfortable, but knowing that when we feel uncomfortable, that's the moment that we can start growing and making real change. So if you have any questions, *# also in the chat box. And Stevie has said thanks for sharing that information about women in voting. She had never heard of that before. So thank you all. All right, let's keep learning.
Thank you. So next I want to talk about disability history as it's been passed to be taught in schools. So when I was a student delegate at the Youth Leadership Forum, that was the first time that I had learned about any of the history that we're talking about today. And even so, it was only a snippet of the history that I know now because of the research that I've done on my own or seen other presentations since then. But the important piece of having disability history taught is right now it's not mandated to be taught in schools. We learn about civil rights movement, we learn about women's rights, we learn about, in certain places we might learn about the Chicano rights. But as a person with a disability, I didn't understand or know that there was a culture and a movement and a whole history that was erased for me to know and access. But in 2006, there was a group of young students, again, a youth-led movement to have, in West Virginia, to have the third week of October Disability History Week. And there's a picture of someone wearing a suit who's signing, I'm assuming, the bill to have disability history taught in schools. And after West Virginia did this in 2006, other states followed suit, so North Carolina, Washington State, Colorado, and California. And I had the honor and privilege of being a part of that movement in California in 2009, 2010. But it's important for not just students with disabilities to understand their history, but also non-disabled students and educators as well to have this be a part of the conversation and change those perceptions of what our history has been and what we want it to look like in the future. Changing it from seeing us as a very medicalized, othered community or group, because in order to have a community, you have to have conversations and be acknowledged, and not a lot of times are we having these conversations. So sometimes people don't see disability as having a community. So I would say group. But I know that other states still haven't passed it, and it would be extremely important to move towards that direction so that students can start learning in their textbooks or even outside of textbooks, because not always are we learning or seeing representation in textbooks. So even in other platforms and having people speak on their lived experience. But either way, it's important to acknowledge that disability history is now something that we have access to, and that's thanks to the youth who decided that this was something important enough to them and that this was something they wanted to see, not just for their peers, but also for generations in the future. So the next slide, please. And then now we are going to go into different laws and policies. We've hinted at a few that we've pulled out for the education and healthcare and employment policies, but we wanted to look a little bit more into the current pieces of laws and policies as they relate to us today. So in 2009, there was a youth-led movement called Spread the Word to End the Word campaign, and it launched in schools K through 12 and universities around the country, enlisting people to end the word and instead of using mental retardation and switching it with the phrase intellectual disability. So in 2010, Rosa's Law, who the law is named after, changed it in both federal health, education, and labor statutes. I think the reason I wanted to highlight this specifically is because being politically correct and the terms and the language that we use within the disability community is a moving target. It changes every day, and there's best practices of ways that we talk about disability. But it also changes depending on who you're talking to. I prefer different things than maybe what Scott prefers or what somebody else that you might work with prefer. And so my suggestion and ask of you is to be okay with being uncomfortable and acknowledging that language is the hardest thing to change. But if we have conversations and ask people what their preferences are, whether it's saying people first, or some people don't prefer people first, asking people how they want to be talked about and described really gives not only you power, but also youth. So that was the chunk behind changing this language is people didn't want to be referred to in a certain way, and so they changed the language. And again, another youth-led movement. So please know that although this happened in 2010 and it's pretty current, like I said, it's a moving target, and so it could change again tomorrow. But the reason why we change our language is so that we can feel empowered in how we identify and how we're acknowledging other people around us.
And a really quick thing, I don't know if you mentioned it, Rosa is actually, when this law was signed in, she was 9 years old, and so her family, her parents, and her other young siblings, they all worked together with the Obama administration to really try to push this through. So 9 years old was the person that is behind that, and that's why it's named after that. So just thought you would like to know what youth is defined as. A lot of times we talk about that, and really it's not. It's as young as you want to be.
Thank you. Perfect. Thank you.
And so the next kind of emerging law, the next big thing that we hope to see happen is the Disability Integration Act. And the Disability Integration Act has been kicked around. I've been doing this type of advocacy for, this is actually my 19th year, which I'm really kind of embarrassed to admit, but laws like this have been being kicked around since then. But what this is essentially, it has addressed the fundamental issue that people who need long-term supports and services, which is normally some sort of a nursing home, some sort of an institutional-based setting, that they're forced into institutions and they risk losing their rights because those same services are not available in the community. And so in a lot of our states, we have this program called Money Follows the Person. And in North Dakota, we do. And when we explain that to legislators, they're like, well, that sounds beautiful, that money can follow you into your community. It's not necessarily how it works, though. But that's what the Disability Integration Act would do. It would say that if a service or if a dollar is available for you in the community, in an institution, that same money should be available for you in the community. And, you know, it builds momentum every year, but this has the opportunity to truly be ADA-sized legislation to really legitimately free our brothers and sisters from nursing homes and other type institutions, to really free up that opportunity so that more opportunities exist for people in the community. And so I just think that, you know, it really does have that potential as we look forward, and that could be that issue. If those young people we're working with today are looking back on in 20 years and saying, boy, I was there when the Disability Integration Act became law. And I remember what it was like when you couldn't get home and community-based services in nursing homes. A majority of the money across the country went into long-term care facilities. This is that opportunity that we can use going forward. So that's kind of the hopes and dreams of the Disability Integration Act. So next slide.
So that is the majority and the chunk of our disability history presentation content-wise. And when I present with youth, I usually end with an ask or a challenge. And so today I want to ask and challenge all of you to first think of yourself and the youth that you work with as the leaders that you've been searching for. So instead of searching outwards, but acknowledging that we have the power and the community and the willingness to be the change that we want to see. And that means learning our history, and that means creating a sense of pride within our identity. And the ask and the question that I want to leave you all with is, what change do you want to see by 2039 that you can be a part of? And it doesn't mean that you have to be the one only charismatic leader. You don't have to be the only person doing the work, but what contribution or idea or ways that you can support the movement, what does that look like for you, and what are we going to achieve by 2039? And that's 20 years from now. So if we're thinking about how far we've come in the last 20 years, imagine how much further we can be 20 years from now, and how powerful that will be for the young people that you're working with to look back and say, when I was 16, I got to be a part of this movement. And now as someone who is going to be turning 40, I got to see that change and help the future generations. So that is all that we have for you. We want to leave some room for questions or comments if you have any. But this has been a great honor and privilege to be able to present and work alongside Scott and Sierra, and thank you for the opportunity, and thank you all for being a witness to this presentation and giving us your time and your energy today.
Okay, really quick, so we would love to hear your take on some of this. Are there some important pieces that you're going to be able to take back and teach the young people around you, or maybe just the people around you in general? You know, what little wisdom, nugget of wisdom, as Mary always puts it, What are you able to take away, or what do you still have questions about? So please join us in a conversation or questions if you have them. We have a little bit of time here. Again, to be the broken record, the chat box at the bottom, the person at the top of the screen, you can click on them with their hand raised, or you can press *# if you want to ask a question that way. And while we're waiting for those things to come in, because I'm wondering if we ask those questions, if we start having a lot of those conversations when we see 2039, will it be different? Because one thing that we discovered, Scott, Rosie, and myself, as we were having this conversation, is we talk about pre-ADA conversation so much that sometimes we forget what's happening now, what's happened in the last 5 years. That will be history tomorrow. And that is the history that the youth are living. So I'm just curious on how we're going to take what we've learned and really go and do something with it, as Rosie had mentioned. Challenge piece. So Stevie had mentioned inclusive class of students with and without disabilities. And that's a great way. A lot of times people will open up their classrooms if they're a classroom full of students with disabilities, and the students without disabilities right across the hall aren't getting any of that valuable information. That's really great.
And I think adding to that, Stevie, a little bit too, is that, and I know Rosie talked, the more we can do to integrate disability history into history, the more we can do to bridge the gap on that. Because if disability history is only being taught to those of us who have disabilities, that's not good enough. We have to actually have to invite others to be part of our culture as well and part of our story. So.
Yeah, and check if your state has a disability history curriculum, an awareness month, anything like that. You know, we're in February, Black History Month, and a lot of times school will open up to somebody wants to come in and talk about that topic. It doesn't have to just be within that month, but sometimes schools or groups are a little bit more open during those months if it's a topic. Yeah, Stevie is like, it's everybody's history. So true.
Absolutely.
Yep. And then Bernie said, very true. Since it is a social movement, attitudes aren't changed without education and exposure. Yep, that's very true. And hopefully you can use some of the resources that we mentioned throughout this that we'll send afterwards as well, and continue and grow your education on these different topics. And share them with us, for sure. So while, and *# if you want to jump into the conversation at all on the phone, while you're maybe thinking and talking about that, just to let you know, April also does youth peer-to-peer mentoring. And so what that is, it's where a mentor, so a young person or a person that works in youth transition in their center can come out to your center or Silk or YLF for a 2-day in-person training on goals that you may have at your center or your program to help you grow from where you're at, help put a certain program or ideas that you have into action and help you through that process. And you'll get to work with that mentor on action steps and goals that you all establish together for 6 months. You have access to these calls while you're on that mentoring, and those are for free during that time. And the youth peer-to-peer mentoring is free of charge. So, and we only have 3 slots a year. So if you're definitely interested, please contact me. The youth peer-to-peer mentoring program is funded from the Independent Living and Research Utilization. So you might have heard of ILRU. And so that is why it is free. So we're so grateful that that's part of it. And we mention this on this call because, as you can see, the 4th one down, a lot of times your center may not have disability history or awareness when you come in. And that may not be a subject that was covered. And so having that as a SIL or Silk staff or Silk board member or part of the community is vital, going back to Brittany's comment of education. So If that's something that you're interested in as a mentoring, please let us know. Those on the others on the screen that are listed of other areas that may be a goal or program area that you would like to see in your center. For any information on this topic or on the peer-to-peer mentoring, please contact me. My information is on the screen. I'm also dropping in the chat box the next call that you can mark your calendar is April 3rd from 2 o'clock to 3:30 Eastern Time, so wherever you fall in that time zone. If you want to join us then, we're going to be talking about how do you move from being a facilitator, or excuse me, a lecturer to a facilitator. How do you get youth involved in your conversation and really engaged in what you're wanting to learn and joining in there. And then I see Rosie has just dropped her contact information in there if you would like to contact her. And then if you could just let us know how today was. We always want to continue to improve your experience on these calls, and we value your input. So if you could just follow that link and complete that quick survey, it's literally like 3 or 4 questions. And just let us know how we're doing and how we can improve, and if you want to connect with anything that we're doing. So thank you all for joining in. Scott and Rosie, thank you so much. You guys are so valuable, and I'm so great that we got to have this conversation with you today. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate this opportunity.
All right. Well, everybody go out and educate somebody else on all the new things that you learned. We'll talk to everybody on April 3rd.